After 12 months defending his country overseas, Sergeant Mark Rojas finally came home. But his dream of peace was shattered the moment he walked to his mailbox. Tucked among the welcome homes was a single, crisp envelope from the HOA. Not a thank you. Not a welcome back. A bill, a $10,000 fine for a crime he didn't even know he had committed. His hands trembled, not from the horrors of war, but from the betrayal waiting for him on his own quiet street. How do you fight an enemy that isn't on a battlefield, but right next door? If you've ever faced a ridiculous fine or a power-tripping HOA, hit subscribe now. You won't believe how this story ends. The house on Cypress Lane was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a promise of normalcy, of quiet mornings, of a life built on solid ground instead of shifting sand. For Sergeant Mark Rojas, it was the anchor he'd held on to during every long, grueling month of his deployment. He'd purchased the modest, well-kept ranch home just weeks before his unit shipped out, a whirlwind of paperwork signed between training exercises. It was his stake in the world he was sworn to protect. Mark was the kind of man who believed in order, in structure, in clear lines of right and wrong. The military had honed that instinct, and he naively assumed the meticulously manicured lawns and identical mailboxes of the Pinecrest Estates community reflected those same values. The Homeowners Association, with its thick binder of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CCNRs, seemed like just another set of rules to follow. He'd skimmed it, noted the basics about grass height and fence colors, and trusted that, as long as he was a good neighbor, he'd have nothing to fear. He'd arranged for a local high school kid, a neighbor's son, to handle the most basic upkeep. The instructions were simple. Mow the lawn every other week, grab any flyers stuck in the door, and make sure nothing looked blatantly abandoned. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was the best he could do from 7,000 miles away. His mind, he was fulfilling his duty. He was maintaining his property. He was playing by the rules. What Mark didn't know was that in Pinecrest Estates, the rules were a living, breathing entity, constantly interpreted and enforced with an iron fist by the HOA board president, Evelyn Sharp. To the residents, Evelyn wasn't just a president, she was a sovereign. Her reign was built not on fairness, but on a fanatical devotion to an arbitrary concept of perfection. She patrolled the streets not in a golf cart, but in a pristine white sedan, her eyes missing nothing. A trash can left out an hour too long, a single weed defiantly sprouting in a crack of a driveway, a curtain hanging slightly askew. She knew Sergeant Rojas was deployed. The entire street had gotten a polite, almost proud notice from the HOA announcing that a brave service member was among them and to please be mindful of the increased quiet hours. It was a performative gesture, a flag pin on a lapel. Because while the community was told to be mindful of noise, Evelyn began to be mindful of something else entirely: the Rojas property. The lawn, though mowed, often grew a little too tall. Between the kids' visits, a single porch light bulb burned out for 2 weeks. A small patriotic flag he'd left on the porch became slightly frayed at the edges. These were not violations to a reasonable person. They were the minor, understandable wear and tear of an absent homeowner. But to Evelyn Sharp, they were cracks in her perfect world. They were insults to the pristine order she fought so zealously to maintain, and she began to document each one, meticulously, clinically. A file was opened, photographs were taken, dates were logged, the stage was set, the pieces were in motion. A man fighting a war abroad, and a woman preparing to start one at home. Sergeant Rojas's promise of a peaceful return was about to collide with Evelyn Sharp's promise of absolute control, and the first shot in this quiet, petty war would be fired not with a weapon, but with a piece of paper. The first notice arrived just 3 weeks after Mark had left. A grainy, time-stamped photo of his lawn, the grass bordering on the maximum permitted height. A warning, a courtesy, the letter stated. Mark, checking his email in a dusty outpost, dismissed it. A simple oversight. He fired off a quick message to the kid next door, who apologized and promised to be more frequent. But the notices were just beginning. They trickled in, then poured. A fine of $50 for a non-approved faded decorative flag on the EA porch. Another $100 for a persistent failure to maintain gutter cleanliness, evidenced by a single photo of a single pine needle caught in a corner. $200 for an unsecured trash receptacle lid after a windy day, a violation he was powerless to prevent from another continent. Mark's frustration grew with each email alert. He tried to reason, sending polite replies to the generic HOA address, explaining his situation, his deployment, his reliance on a helper. The responses were always the same: cold, automated, and utterly inflexible. They were not emails, but legal pronouncements. The covenants are clear. All homeowners are subject to the same standards. Deployment status does not exempt one from contractual obligations. The humanity had been stripped away, replaced by bureaucratic venom. The true escalation began when Evelyn Sharp decided a simple helper was no longer sufficient. She declared the property a nuisance and invoked a rarely used bylaw that allowed the HOA to hire its own contractor for essential maintenance to protect community property values. Without his consent, a landscaping company began showing up weekly, mowing his lawn, trimming his bushes, and sending him the invoice. The charges were exorbitant. $60 for a mow that should cost $25. $100 for weed mitigation in a single flower bed. Mark's bank account, already strained from maintaining a home he wasn't living in, began to bleed. The fines and the forced services were a financial siege. He felt a helpless rage more profound than anything he'd felt in combat. Over there, the enemy was clear. Here, the enemy was a phantom, hiding behind paragraphs of legalese, snipering him with invoices. The final straw, the one that broke the back of his patience, was a new violation. A notice condemning his structurally unsound and hazardous mailbox. The photo showed the standard, developer-installed wooden post with a tiny, almost invisible hairline crack at its base. The demand was immediate. Replace it with a board-approved model or face a $50 daily fine until compliance was met. He was being extorted. It was no longer about grass or gutters. It was a raw display of power. Evelyn wasn't just enforcing rules. She was inventing them, twisting them to prove a point. She was demonstrating, in the pettiest way possible, that she owned not just the community, but everyone in it. Mark's determination solidified into a cold, hard resolve. The fight was no longer about the money. It was about principle. It was about justice. He began meticulously saving every email, every fine, every invoice. He documented everything, his military training kicking in. He was gathering intelligence on his target. He had one last desperate card to play. He forwarded the entire damning chain of correspondence to the JAG legal office on his base, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fury. The response was a lifeline. They confirmed the obvious. This was harassment, likely violating the BAE, Service Members Civil Relief Act. They promised to send a letter on his behalf. For a week, there was a blissful, terrifying silence. No new fines, no new emails. Mark dared to hope the letter from the Army had worked, that the shadow war was over. Then, the silence broke. A new email arrived in his inbox. Its subject line was chilling in its simplicity. Final notice and intent. To lean. The body of the email was a single, itemized statement. It listed every fine, every forced service charge, every accruing daily penalty for the mailbox. The total, circled at the bottom in a bold digital font, was a number that stole the air from his lungs. $10,187.50, pay in full within 30 days of receipt, it stated, or a lien would be placed on his home. They weren't just fining him anymore. They were coming for his anchor. for his promise, for the very roof over the head he hadn't even slept under in a year. Sergeant Mark Rojas was thousands of miles from home, but the battle for it had just begun, and he was now officially out of options. The 30-day countdown on the lien threat became a ticking time bomb in Mark's mind. He returned home not to peace, but to a war zone of paperwork and quiet fury. The JAG letter had been ignored. Polite requests had been met with cold, legalistic stonewalling. He was out of options, and Evelyn Sharp knew it. She expected him to fold, to pay the extortionate sum, to be just another homeowner she had broken. But Sergeant Rojas had spent a year in a place where pressure didn't make you fold. It forged you into a weapon. His countermove was not emotional. It was tactical, precise, and devastating. He discovered the date of the next open HOA board meeting. He didn't send an angry email. He didn't make a threat. He simply arrived. Dressed not in his uniform, but in clean, simple civilian clothes, he took a seat in the back of the community clubhouse. He was a ghost at the feast, watching Evelyn hold court, efficiently dismissing resident concerns about pool hours and holiday decoration policies with a condescending smile. Then, during the open forum, he stood up. The room went quiet. All eyes turned to the stranger, the soldier they'd heard about but never seen. Evelyn's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing with impatient curiosity. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. He introduced himself. Then he held up a single thick binder. "This," he said, his voice cutting through the sterile air, "is not my service record. This is yours." He began to methodically dismantle her reign, page by page. He projected documents onto the screen meant for landscaping proposals. Time-stamped violation notices sent while he was confirmed to be in an active combat zone. Invoices for forced services at rates triple the market value, paid to a landscaping company that shared a business address with Evelyn Sharp's brother-in-law. He revealed the bylaw she had twisted to authorize it, highlighting the clause that stated it was only for emergency abatement of immediate health hazards, not lawn maintenance. Then he delivered the legal bombshell. He wasn't just a homeowner. He was a protected service member under the SCRA. The fines, the liens, the harassment, it was all illegal, a federal crime. He wasn't there to ask for mercy. He was there to present evidence. But the final crushing blow was yet to come. He clicked to the last slide. It was a single grainy security camera still, captured by a neighbor's doorbell camera across the street. It showed Evelyn Sharp's pristine white sedan, parked in front of his house, and it showed Evelyn herself, not inspecting, but deliberately placing a single bag of fast food trash next to his garbage can on a non-collection day. She had manufactured a violation to fine him. The gasp in the room was audible. The petty tyranny was laid bare for all to see. It wasn't about rules. It was about corruption. It was about a pathetic abuse of power so profound it took a soldier's discipline to expose it. Evelyn Sharp's face drained of all color. She tried to speak, to gavel the meeting to order, but her authority had evaporated into the humiliated silence of the room. She wasn't a president anymore. She was a defendant, caught on camera, her empire of pettiness crumbling around her in a community clubhouse. Mark looked directly at her, the silence stretching into eternity. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had irrevocably turned. The war for his home had finally found its battlefield, and the HOA president had just lost the high ground. The silence in that community clubhouse was more powerful than any gavel strike. In that moment, Evelyn Sharp's reign of terror ended. The evidence was irrefutable, the federal law was clear, and the moral authority she had cloaked herself in was ripped away, revealing the petty vindictiveness beneath. The other board members, some complicit, some merely cowed, immediately moved to table all fines and liens against Sergeant Rojas pending a full third-party review. It was a desperate attempt to save face, but it was a surrender nonetheless. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The $10,287.50 in fines were not just waived, they were formally voided, expunged from his account as if they had never existed. A certified letter of apology arrived from the HOA's legal counsel, a document so carefully worded it was clearly written through gritted teeth. But it was an admission of fault all the same. Evelyn Sharp did not go quietly, but she did go. Facing a recall vote fueled by the united outrage of neighbors who now saw their own potential futures in Mark's struggle, she resigned from the board before she could be officially ousted. The landscaping contract with her brother-in-law's company was immediately terminated and investigated for fraud. The Sharp bylaws, her personal interpretations of the CC&Rs, were systematically reviewed and rewritten by a new, more reasonable board, one that included several residents who had been inspired by Mark's courage to run for office themselves. Mark's victory was not just personal, it was communal. He had not simply won his own fight, he had broken a cycle of fear. Neighbors he'd never met stopped him on his morning runs to thank him, sharing their own stories of small, quiet harassments they'd been too intimidated to challenge. The pristine streets of Pinecrest Estates looked the same, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The air was no longer thick with the anxiety of crossing an unseen line. It was light with a hard-won sense of freedom. Sergeant Mark Rojas had finally found the peace he had fought for. He could sit on his porch, watching the sun set over a lawn that was, by his own definition, perfectly manicured. He had defended his home, not from a foreign enemy, but from a domestic one hiding behind a veneer of authority. He had proven that the greatest weapon against petty tyranny is not anger, but truth. Not chaos, but meticulous, undeniable evidence. His story is a powerful reminder that the battle for home isn't always fought on distant soil. Sometimes it's fought at your own mailbox, against an enemy who mistakes kindness for weakness and rules for weapons. But it also shows that one person, armed with courage and principle, can stand up to even the most entrenched power and win. So the next time you see a perfectly manicured lawn or a row of identical mailboxes, ask yourself, what is the true cost of that perfection? And more importantly, who is really paying the price? If Sergeant Rojas's story fired you up, if you felt that surge of frustration and then that wave of satisfaction, then you know how these battles feel. But his story is just one of thousands. This is where you come in. Did this HOA overstep? What would you have done in Mark's situation? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Have you ever faced a petty rule, a power-hungry board member, or an insane fine? Share your experience. Your story could be the warning that helps someone else. But don't stop there. Help us expose this kind of injustice. Smash that like button to push this video into the feeds of others who need to see it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because we release new videos every week diving deep into the wild world of property drama, neighbor wars, and fighting back against unfair power. Together, we can turn these stories from warnings into weapons. Subscribe now and join the fight.